got a mic. Is that work? Yes. I'm Spencer Reiss from Wired Magazine. We have the same hair color. We just decided to confuse you guys. Ray Ozzie really doesn't need an introduction, so I'll go ahead and try anyway with a really quick one, which is that, I mean, what I love about Ray is he simultaneously has had an amazing career at the biggest, most important technology companies in the world, meaning IBM and Microsoft, while at the same time having started and then gone back to, and now gone back to again, the world of startups and entrepreneurship. And so I think Ray has a really, you know, he's seen both sides now, as the song goes. And he's somebody I think that is particularly appropriate for that reason, especially in a place like Korea, where those issues are very much live in front of everybody. So with no further ado, I just wanted to say, first, Ray, you kind of made a career going back to Lotus Notes, Groove Networks, which you sold to Microsoft, helping people interact with each other. It seems like, what was the germ of that? Why did you identify that as the thing you wanted to do for your life?
So before I answer that, I just wanted to thank the people from SparkLabs and many of the people who have had us out here. I really enjoy coming to Korea. Each time I come, I learn more. I've had the opportunity to speak with many of the people from startups and understand the challenges and opportunities of the startup ecosystem. So anyway, thank you for having me. My passion, much of my career, has been in an area that in academics they refer to as computer-supported cooperative work. And that's the use of technology to help augment human interaction for productive purposes. I won't spend too much time on this, but I was very fortunate when I was at college at University of Illinois to be exposed in 1974, 75 to a system called Plato, which was an early system for computer-based education. But as a side effect of building the system, they built many tools that today we take for granted, but in the mid-70s, were quite unique. We who were on Plato had a little chance, a peek of what the internet would become with online interactive chat, online discussions, email, online interactive gaming. At the time, we regarded it as massive, multiplayer gaming, even though it was hundreds of people, not, hundreds of thousands. But it gave us a peek at how technology could be used to augment interaction. I had some very specific, very impactful experiences on Plato that made it very effective to do project management and work with others without ever meeting them face to face. And when I went off to industry in the late 70s, there was no such thing. People were using mini computers and mainframes, and were not using the computer as a communication device. So I and several of the people who I worked with in college decided this was going to be what we did. We were going to try to help use computers and technology to help people interact. This product, Lotus Notes, was based on certain concepts of a program called Plato Notes many years earlier, except applied to a business context. And we learned a lot. There were many things that succeeded about it and certain things that didn't.
Unique was doing a startup in that space at that time? And this is the time when IBM, for instance, dominated everything, right?
That's right. Yeah.
How did you do, what gave you the courage to do a startup?
Well, my father was a small business person, and I used to go to the office with him, and I really enjoyed the environment of a small company. The first time I went to work for a business, it was a larger company. And so I tended to idolize the notion of what it would be like to have something that was under your control and to have people who treated each other well and more like a family as you were accomplishing a mission together. But I didn't have a pattern of how to do it in high tech, and I struggled. I tried to get financing for my first company, and I failed. I went to venture capital seminars and tried to learn. I wrote business plans, sent them to the local Boston venture capitalists. I heard nothing back. I got one letter back from a venture capitalist at the time, Greylock, who was very polite and basically just said, "We don't know what you're talking about. We don't know if it's ahead of its time or if it's nonsense, but we're not interested in investing." I was fortunate that because of relationships, because I got a job and an introduction to someone who himself was a founder, over time, after doing some work for him, which was Mitch Kapor at Lotus, we did a deal later on where, because he could trust me then, he helped me get financing for what I wanted to do, which was this Lotus Notes project.
Wow. So that, I mean, one of the themes we wanted to talk about a little bit here today was the shift, the pendulum shift from centralized systems to distributed systems,
yes.
Now seemingly back to what everybody calls the cloud, but which in the old days looks kind of like, wow, that's back to mainframe almost. How do you see that? Are we or another way of putting that is the post-PC world? Do you accept that as a matter of course?
It is interesting that over the course of my career, things have shifted a lot. We started, when I first came into the business, it was a mainframe business, which was centralized, and there were a lot of similarities between today's cloud computing world and mainframes. There was an operating system called MVS, which was virtual machines, that were centralized, and then things started getting smaller with mini computers. But the personal computer was very unique because the whole concept of it was a hobbyist machine. You could do anything with it. The hardware specs were open. The software specs were open. You could even though it was a very small computer, you could do with it what you want, and that spawned a tremendous amount of innovation. The problem with the PC world, the good was that there was a lot of innovation. The problem was it was very difficult from a distribution perspective. You had to develop things very carefully, then establish a relationship with the distributor, print these things on floppy disks, shrink wrap them, get them out to customers. You really couldn't update it more than every few years because...
This is pre-internet.
This is all pre-internet. Right. But that was really the core of the PC era, began pre-internet. There was a lot of freedom to do what you want, but you couldn't really get things to many customers very easily, and the market was very small. With the internet, it began the pendulum swing back toward centralization, and in essence, the browser of today is very similar to the intelligent terminal of old. The logic is really centralized, and it sends down a little bit of code to run on the client, but most of what's happening is centralized. There are a lot of advantages to centralized systems. You can distribute things to clients very, very quickly. You can keep those clients up to date. You can have centralized marketplaces. Everyone can rendezvous with identity very, very easily. Architecturally, it's a much simpler thing, and because we have increasingly good bandwidth, it's easier for us to all use centralized systems. There are some downsides to centralization. One of them is that it's fragile. If the centralized system goes down, lots of users go down. The flip side of centralizing your storage is that commercial interests and others might have access to that information when you really want to treat it personally. The question you asked is it a pendulum? Does it go back and forth, and are we going to go back to personal? I really think it's going to be very difficult and very niche to go truly back to personal, because to go personal really means disconnecting in many ways from the internet, or going, having things that go directly from one client to another. It is possible, and there will be people who do it for private, secure communications reasons, and so on. But I really do think that over the long haul, we are more or less unilaterally in a post-personal era and more into a networked era.
It's kind of ironic that when you have this, this thing in your hand, which is famously, more powerful than one of those mini computers you were playing around with in the 70s, you have this amazing power, and yet it's effectively useless without the central. I mean, you can play little games on it or something, but if you don't have a connection, it's just a brick.
That's right. That's right.
And it's quite a. I mean, but I guess we still, even now, there are people talking about, for instance, doing video processing on the server rather than here. I mean, they're actually still trying to, even as this thing gets more and more powerful as a machine, it gets kind of dumber in a way. Is that a way to look?
More, I think that where computation happens and where storage happens will shift based on different applications and based on time. So, for example, in parts of the world where there is less reliable connectivity, the applications that do more even on the phone will be more pervasive and more than in parts of the world where there's always-on reliable connectivity. But the thing that I think we are unidirectionally heading into is the fact that there are many entities who are control points. Your phone today in many parts of the world is bound to a telco. Some parts of the world you have independence, between device and SIM, and your prepay versus postpay contracts. But your first point of dependency in many cases is a carrier. Then you have points of dependencies on all the major services. If you're a chat user in Korea, you might be dependent upon KakaoTalk, as a central infrastructure. In China, it might be WeChat. In somewhere else, it might be iMessage or WhatsApp. Over time, voice is no longer going to be a telco function. It'll be an app. And then we each, in various regions or globally, we will pick a voice provider. Social networking, some people choose Twitter or Weibo or Facebook. Each of those represents a centralized provider, and I don't think we're going to have peer-to-peer social networks and things like that as much.
Are you concerned? I mean, if you have this kind of world of a sort of multipolar world, where you have centralized systems, which might in some cases be around a telco or a carrier, in another case it might be around a social network like Facebook.
Yes.
In another case, it might be a nation state like China. Are you worried that, one of the great principles of the internet has always been end-to-end. Are you worried about balkanization? That those systems will effectively stop talking to each other?
I am less worried about balkanization. I think that the internet and technology has proven that, given enough years, the players will change. From one, what seems popular, incredibly popular, how could it ever tip to something else? If you go forward 5 years or 10 years, it will be something else. And I think, I really do believe that, the players that we all regard as dominant right now will change over time. That balkanization does not bother me at all. What worries me is that there is a serious gap and an increasing gap between the capabilities of what the private enterprises and the governments can do with the storage that we put up, in the cloud, and what our perception is as to what they can do with that information. So, I think people generally are very carefree in terms of storing things in the cloud, and commercial enterprises will use it for advertising or for other things, depending on what it suits their business, and governments will do what they need to do, many governments, in looking at patterns of how people interact. I think that's one of the dangers of centralization versus decentralization, where it gives large authorities much more control. And I think the thing that worries me is that individuals should be asking more questions about what is going on with their data and with their communications.
I think you're kind of alluding a little bit to the story that has been in the news in the last week or so about the National Security Agency in the United States, and there was a leak, I guess you'd say, by one of their officials, and now we're all learning about all these things. How do you, when you look at that, the system that we have right now, where they're saying, in effect, every phone call in the United States has at least been logged, if not listened to. I mean, is that something, let's make Ray Ozzie CTO of the United States for 5 minutes. How would you do things differently from the way they appear to be being done now?
I don't think I want to answer that question.
Okay.
And I don't think if there was a CTO, there is a CTO of the United States, but I don't even think that that's the place where decisions should be made. Every country worldwide has its own relationship between its own history, its own deeply rooted history as to how that country got to be the way it is, and it has a different shape of how citizens and what citizens' relationship with government is, and the shape of government. In my opinion, I am very much for transparency of what rights should be, what the deal is between citizens and the government in any given country. In the US, there's a lot of news because journalists and people were surprised in some way, shape, or form. I just don't think there should be so much surprise. In many parts of the world, there's just an assumption that the government is watching the telecommunications traffic, and in that society, those societies, it's much more open, and there's an open dialogue.
That is a kind of transparency, isn't it? If everyone just assumes.
But that's the kind of transparency. Whether what you do is separate from being transparent about what you do. And I'm not saying that governments shouldn't be able to do things covertly when they need to do something in order to investigate something and so on. I'm saying that if people view their basic liberties as how they communicate and privacy, privacy is a very, very important thing, and there's a lot of history in the nature of privacy laws in Europe. In the U.S., there's a view of the Fourth Amendment rights and things like that. They're constitutional rights that people are brought up with when they're trained in early education. I just think the thing that is worrisome is when there is surprise. There shouldn't be that level of surprise. There should be open debate about the type of system that you're living in.
Flipping it all around, another classic criticism of centralized systems is the brittleness, is the single point of failure. That if Google goes down, half of the people in the United States will be unable to communicate with each other. How do you think we're handling that well now? I
think we're actually handling that amazingly well. I never would have predicted 10 years ago, even if we knew that the pendulum was swinging towards centralization. I'm extremely impressed with the likes of Google, of Microsoft's Azure product, of Amazon Web Services, in terms of having infrastructures that are capable of being broadly parallel and having programming models, open source programming models, that you can write code that runs in these environments, such that if it goes out in one place, it still is operating in other places and can still be serving customers. I think that there's a lot of resilience in systems compared to the old days. I'm not sure how many of you have traditionally used corporate email systems like Lotus Notes or Microsoft Exchange. In those days, we built systems that, with the assumption that the IT people could take the system down over the weekend and upgrade them and bring it up on, by Monday. That's how we built systems, and it was very hard to scale systems that way, and we didn't even try to keep them up 24/7. 24/7 was reserved for financial systems and ATMs. Now I think the level of consumer services that we all have that we just assume will be up 24/7, I think it's pretty good, relatively speaking.
Okay, we're at the next conference here. One of the
Sure.
things everybody likes to talk about as next is what I guess Internet of Things, some people call it. I saw Paul Jacobs now calling it from Qualcomm the Internet of Everything. The idea that the chair will have every single piece of anything.
Right.
What are the implications of that for this whole, is that going to change everything, or is it going to be just another evolutionary step?
Well, first of all, it's a great question to ask as compared to the previous question, because if everything has a sensor in it, which I believe it will, I believe that heating and air conditioning systems, the elevators, the escalators that we took coming into this building, we're rapidly moving to an environment where the manufacturers of those systems have sensors in them, and they know that there are problems with that escalator well before the people who own the building, who have the escalator, know it, and they can send people out because they get the big data from those sensors, and they can monitor them well in advance. I think everything, whether it's lighting, whether it's our health, sensors are going to be absolutely pervasive, but those rely on cloud infrastructure that is extremely reliable. The communications infrastructure that's very reliable, because that data is flowing and lives may depend on the fact that that data is flowing in. Right now, we build certain smart devices like heart monitors and things like that in a way that can work standalone, and they don't need to be in a network connection, for your heart to keep pumping. But in many cases, there will be devices that many of us start to incorporate into our bodies that need to talk to the internet once a day in order to keep operating, much as people take medications once a day to keep their bodies functioning. We will become more and more reliant upon these systems and become extensions of it.
One of the things we were talking about in the room just before, there's this paradox that as we get more and more power in the devices, as they are more capable and able to sense things more, people increasingly are living in this moment, as opposed to being more aware of the larger world around them. That's right. Even as the thing has the ability to record your entire life. I mean, there are people now who are quantified self people going around recording everything they do, everything they say. It's a perfectly feasible thing to do.
Right.
How do you see that playing out? I mean, do people going to just sort of disappear into their phones, or?
I think we're in a transitional time. Personally, I think I'll say I hope we're in a transitional time where we're learning how to cope with the fact that we have this other world that we look at through the portal of the phone. Many of us, especially us with gray hair, lived a good part of our lives, without that. I grew into a world where there was a telephone.
It had a wire.
And it had a wire, but there was that kind of connection. Kids who are growing up into the world now, there was no world without social networks, before and things like that. So
we just didn't know they were social networks.
Right. I'm hoping that people are having problems right now because we're in a transitional phase, and that better social norms will take hold. Yesterday I was walking just here outside the COEX building, and I almost got hit by somebody on a scooter who was texting on their phone and didn't stop at the crosswalk because they were preoccupied. I'm hoping that over time, some of these things, that it will become more part of how we manage our lives and not so special and people being so absorbed, but we'll see.
What do you think? I mean, looking at the world of UI, UX, user experience, user interface, where do you, I mean, sometimes I look at them and I go, wow, this is amazing, and other times I think, wow, this is still the same old, we still can't talk to it. I mean, really.
Well, I think that will change dramatically. People laugh right now at Google Glass because it's so clunky, visually, but that's like the early PCs or the mainframe. It will disappear into our jewelry, our clothing, our glasses. There will be a time when, and not too far down the road, where you won't know if these glasses that I'm wearing are active glasses or not, because these are actually very thick frames. You could put a lot of energy, battery life into that that frame, and it can tether to a device. So I think it should become more of the norm that instead of having a woman having to shuffle around in her bag to pull out the phone and to do something, or for a guy to reach into their jacket, I think there will be more signals that are made available in a way that lets us stay more connected with the moment, and I look forward to that. But that does bring a lot of negative things too, like the question of, am I being recorded? If I'm interacting with you, should I watch what I say, because are you recording it? Right. Are you recording the audio, or are you recording it visually? But even if you're not recording it, is the person next to you recording it, and so on? I think that concerns me a lot, and I think that there should be early discussion by legislators in different countries to establish the law so that we can go into this era with norms that people are comfortable with.
Let's just switch. We also have this is the next event, and startups and innovation are a big part of the reason we're all here.
Right.
One of the common criticisms that you hear, certainly in Silicon Valley these days, is that most of the startups that people see lack a big vision. That people are building trivial little things instead of building the next Facebook or the next Google. They're doing pet food delivery or whatever. Right. I mean, do you agree with that criticism?
I agree with the observation. I don't know if I would criticize it. Okay. So there are two sides, and I'll bet these two sides are represented in this room. There's an investor side and there's an entrepreneur side. Mm-hmm. From an investor side, one must go in with your eyes open and decide, am I smart enough to be investing in a startup because I understand what they're doing and they're going to be a winner, or am I investing in a sector more like an index fund? You could invest in many, many, many small of these projects and as an index fund and say, I know one of them is going to hit, I'm not going to think about which one. And I think those people will likely be more successful than the people who are trying to pick winners, because it's very difficult with those small things. But from an entrepreneur perspective, I think it's actually tremendous, because people in different parts in different ages and different parts of society had different ways of doing apprenticeship, learning their craft, learning their trade. Entrepreneurs who are in startups are not just big believers in the product that they're doing and maybe going to change the world or not. They're learning their trade, and they're learning what it's like to be an entrepreneur, to be a leader, and to recruit and get other people to believe in them, to build architecture, to build technology, to build user experience. And each one of those, I just don't believe in the word failure. When these startups do something and they fail and they do not accomplish great business results, it's still a very, very positive thing because they will have developed their career to the next level. And whether they want to do another startup or go off and work in a larger company on something with potentially a greater impact because of the number of people that an existing market product touches, they will be more valuable to the people who hire them because they have gone through that experience. So I'm just very positive about these things. Is it a noisy environment in the App Store when you see 1,000 flashlight apps? Yeah, that's it's a little noisy, but I'll bet you a lot of those people learned something that they will apply to the next thing that they do, and so on. I just wouldn't invest in flashlight apps.
So in other words, the fact that it's easy, as some people would say, to do a startup these days is a feature, not a bug.
I think it's a feature. It's training a lot of people in many aspects of engineering and entrepreneurialism who might not have had a way of doing that. In my era, when I was coming out of school, you really didn't have that kind of a choice. You had to basically go to a small, mid-size, or large company and work for someone else and learn your trade in the context of that large company. And many people left within 1 or 2 years because then they wanted to go do something. This is just yet another option for young people to learn their trade. And in times like today, I think it's good to teach people skills of agility that you learn as an entrepreneur, because in the job market today, you will probably have 4 or 5 careers over your lifetime, and getting this notion of agility and shaping your own path, I think, will help people a lot, regardless of where you are in the world.
So what does that mean for the big companies of the world? I mean, the micros. I mean, or you look at Google. A day rarely goes by where you don't see an announcement of X person has left Google to do a startup, or Y person has left Facebook to go to. I mean, is that real? Is that going to hurt them someday?
No,
or
I don't.
They can just keep on.
I don't think so. I think there are lots of really strong reasons that both big companies and small companies are great, and different people will choose different career paths. Within a large company, you can have a much broader impact, a very broad impact, because of an existing customer base that you can serve. You can listen to those customers, retain those customers, build what they want, leverage broad distribution. And if that's what you want, if you want to make a really big impact, very quickly, being part of a team in a large company is a great way of doing it. However, large companies, by their nature, are not going to be agile. They are not going to move very, very quickly. They may be doing what the customers want, but they're going to have to do it at a slower pace, and it's very difficult for a large incumbent to do radically different things. However, if you want to learn agility and try really bold, daring new things, startups are tremendous, but then it becomes difficult to scale. So each one has its positives and its opportunities. Unfortunately, we are scaled out of time here. So thank you all very much for listening. And Ray's going to be around today. Yeah, I'll be around for a while. Catch him at the coffee break. Thank you. Thank you again.